Welcome to the Peace Catalyst podcast, where we share stories to inspire, uplift, and encourage you in your peacemaking journey. I'm Becca Tyvel, and I work with Peace Catalyst in the Washington, D.C. area. Soon to be in South Africa, though, for a few months. And I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Allie Burnison.
Hey everyone, I'm Allie, and I am with PCI in Los Angeles, California. By the way, if you enjoy the Peace Catalyst podcast, please do us a favor and take some time to rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. It really helps boost our visibility and encourages others to give us a listen.
Yeah, thank you all so much. We really appreciate it. We're really excited to continue our current series where we're talking about how to become the beloved community and finding restoration and healing in the midst of division. This is rooted in the historical origin of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr. And this concept of beloved community is framing our conversations. We're talking to people that we call peace builders who are involving themselves in the ministry of reconciliation, interrupting and challenging oppression, and holding firmly to a vision of justice, restoration, peace, and healing for all members of a community.
So this week, we are just so privileged to interview someone named Jamel Armstrong, who is truly nothing less than a change maker and leader in his church and the wider community of Louisville, Kentucky, faithfully advocating for and working towards the realization of beloved community. A native of Louisville from a young age, Armstrong observed the ongoing socioeconomic and racial injustices that painted reality for many in his community. His upbringing influenced his passion to pursue the vision of beloved community in Louisville and beyond. Armstrong has years of experience as a youth pastor and currently serves as the lead pastor of New Horizon Baptist Church in Louisville. He's also currently pursuing his Master's of Divinity at North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois. So this was just, such an incredible conversation. I loved talking to him, so I'm really excited to get into the episode.
Yeah, me too. And right before we get into our conversation, I will just share our peace quote of the week. Thank you, Allie, for providing this. It's from a book called The Post-Black and Post-White Church, Becoming the Beloved Community in a Multi-Ethnic World. And this book is written by Ephraim Smith. It says, the multi-ethnic and missional church points us to a church where God's love rescues people from the matrix and sin of racial division and delivers us into the reconciling spirit of the beloved community. These churches alone may not totally eradicate or dismantle our race-based society, but they will provide the alternative that many of us hunger for. The multi-ethnic and missional church as a Christ-centered community becomes the beloved community that Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of. It indeed becomes the beloved church that forges the beloved community in the world. This is true kingdom advancement. Wow, I love that quote, and it's so fitting for our conversation today with Pastor Jamel. So thank you, Allie, for pulling that out and sharing it with us. Wow, it's so wonderful having you with us, Jamel, and really excited to learn from you in our Beloved Community series and just about the work that you've been doing in Louisville, Kentucky. So would you like to introduce yourself a little bit, and could you share a bit about your connection to Peace Catalyst?
Sure. Well, first off, again, thank you guys for having me on. My name is Jamel Armstrong. I am the pastor of New Horizon Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. I've been pastoring there for just a little over a year now, which has been something to discuss for other conversations. But that I am the husband of a wonderful wife, Rochelle, and three beautiful children, and one amazing new grandson who's 11 months now. So he's the joy in these days. That's essentially fundamentally who I am. I connected to Peace Catalyst through who's now the, I guess, executive director or president, Martin Brooks, who is a good friend and also a former church member of mine. He attends the church that I used to pastor, and so we're pretty good friends. And yeah, we've done some conferences and things together and connected in the past.
So where in your work right now with New Horizon, you said you're the pastor of the
Yes.
church.
Uh-huh.
Okay, is there any other organization or body that you're kind of working within? I guess like what roles do you occupy, or I guess where do you consider yourself kind of in your ministry, primarily as a pastor, or yeah, does that if that question makes sense?
Yeah, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So starting there, within a pastor, have largely been influenced by history and people who have done grassroots works to build and develop and create community, especially in some of the toughest areas. My grandfather was a church planter, president of the NAACP, who actually died after being poisoned in jail in the 60s in Cincinnati. And so we grew up with the stories of our grandfather and other family members who've been boots on the ground, doing a lot of work. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Fred Shuttlesworth, who was a good friend of Dr. King. Much of the work in Birmingham, Alabama, that he did, Shuttlesworth was one of the persons that he connected with a lot. Shuttlesworth eventually was run out of Alabama, relocated to Cincinnati, and my grandfather worked close with him. And so growing up, we heard a lot about that, those stories from my grandmother about his work and much of that. So it's always been a part of my DNA. My grandfather was a pastor. And so in my mind, the work of a pastor, it coincides with the work of justice and helping to build the beloved community within the church. And so, so that's been a big part of where every place that I've served. I've intentionally served at places where that's been high up on the priority list. But also currently, and I've done a number of things which I won't bore you guys with over time, but currently I also work with a small nonprofit called the Center for Neighborhoods. And basically what we do is we partner with residents in especially disenfranchised communities to help them to build, or partner with them rather is a better term, to build the community in the neighborhood that they hope and know that they can become. And so there are a lot of challenges that they face and occupy. So we come alongside them to help, build the reality of what they believe their community can become.
That's incredible.
Mhm.
That's amazing, and such an incredible legacy that you carry, and your father that was literally part of the civil rights movement.
Mhm.
And yeah, I guess in light of that, when you think of beloved community, what comes to mind for you, um, and what does it mean to be working towards that?
Gotcha. So, when I think about beloved community, I think of it in two ways. Studying Dr. King over the years, and there's a beautiful biography by Taylor Branch called "Parting the Waters," and America during the King years, and he does a good job of. Taylor Branch does rather of really unpacking many of these ideas that kind of formed Dr. Cosby, Dr. King in those early years. And so, um, when I think about beloved community, that was one of the first places unfortunately learned about the beloved community or the ideal of it later in life. But it's some of those fundamental core values and principles of the beloved community: peace, justice, equity, inclusion, diversity, um, um, you know, uh, fighting against poverty and homelessness. Some of those core values that when Dr. King talked about, the beloved community that he hoped that the world would one day be able to actually live up to. Now, in saying that, when I first heard about the beloved community before I began to do my own personal research to learn more about it, you couldn't have told me that when Dr. King was mentioning it, that it was not Dr. King, the civil rights activist, but it was Reverend King, the pastor. I
Mm.
just thought that this has to be an idea about what the church is supposed to be. And so I carried that with me a while until I finally sat down and really done some personal research and study to discover what the history behind it that we all know about. However, I've still carried that with me. That when I think about the beloved community, yes, I think about some of those core values and principles, but I also think about the church.
Mm.
Because I think if there's ever a place where those values and principles ought to be lived out, it ought to be at the church. And so I specifically think about the early church. I think about the early church is the church at its best, the church at its finest hour. And many of those core values was lived out through the early church. It was a diverse church. There were people from all walks of life, a number of regions. It was multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural. It was inclusive, it was diverse, but also they fought against things like poverty. All the believers had all things in common, and they cared for one another. When there was tensions within the community, they dealt with the tensions and the many of the disputes within the community just in a healthy way, and they did not allow those things to be a division amongst the church. But it was core, and what was key to it rather was the fact that they also had, which is what created it, a shared history. And that shared history for them was based upon the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so they they believed in that, they held on to that, and that shared history helped them to cultivate that beloved community that we today essentially are living off of. And so when I think about the beloved community, more first thing that comes to mind is the church, and how I believe that our charge is to try to continue to live within the legacy of how the church began, the church that Jesus Christ wanted us to be, which is a church of inclusion, love, and peace, as opposed to a church of exclusion and hostility towards people who we other at times. So, yeah. So I don't know if I answered all your questions there.
Yeah, definitely. That was
Cool.
great. Thank you so much.
Cool.
And I did just want to follow up because you mentioned something about gaining a deeper knowledge or of the beloved community, or looking
Mhm.
back and seeing like, oh, what does this actually mean, or where does this actually come from, and sort of that history. Could you touch on that a little bit more? I don't know if that makes sense, but not just understanding it in this kind of one sense that you had, but then when you sort of dug deeper, went back further.
Gotcha. So I began as most of us do today, and I contacted my research assistant named Google, and I allowed my research assistant to just open some doors for me. And so I studied and goodness ate the King Center's information up. Just to see, because they have a quite a bit of information on the beloved community in churches all over the world who embrace the attitude, especially since I'd say, I mean, maybe longer, but especially since 2016. There have been a number of churches who have made this commitment to try to figure out what it means to live out those values, reading biographies, which I really believe is key to really understanding, because I like to know what was. Kind of the story behind the story. Sometimes we get it secondhand, and sometimes we don't know its beginnings. Now, I'm saying all this because I'm trying to remember the gentleman whom actually the beloved community originated with, because it was not Dr. King's idea. It was something that he popularized. But there was another gentleman who actually coined the phrase, and Dr. King was part of this peace organization, this justice organization, alongside with with him. And so I just began eating up a number of materials and books and all that just to better inform me. Because when I found out that my initial thoughts about it were flawed, that I figured if I'm going to be out here discussing it and trying to ultimately live up to it, I needed to know where it came from. And so I wanted to find its beginnings, its genesis, and I'm gonna do my best to try to live it out. And so what's going to happen is here shortly, randomly, that name's going to come to my mind, and I'm gonna blurt it out. So just forewarning you guys, that's the way that my mind works. It'll come out and be like, "That's what I was reaching for. There it is." Yeah, it's
I
Please
love
do.
it. Love it. So good.
gotcha.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
And um, I, yeah, I really appreciate the fact that you are connecting it to the early church and to a tradition that, is very authentic within the church.
Yeah.
Um, because, I, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think Jesus ever, uses the phrase beloved community, but you're basically making the case that like it's deeply
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
authentic to
Hmm.
who the church is called to be, and who the church was at its beginning.
Yeah.
Um, so kind of moving from abstract to tangible, we know that you are located in Louisville. I think you might have grown up there from what I saw
Yeah.
online, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
What when we're thinking about beloved community and its connection to confronting injustice and working towards peace, what are the areas of injustice that you observed when, um, yeah, while you've lived there, and kind of where do you find yourself within them?
Gotcha, gotcha. All right. First off, his name is Josiah Royce. He is the founder of the
Yes.
Yeah.
Fellowship of Reconciliation. Yeah, that's his name. Yes. So
Nice.
it hit me. There we go. So had to get that out before I forgot it again. So yeah, I'm a native here in Louisville, and so there's some unique things about Louisville. We rank in the top 10 in the U.S. Of the most segregated cities and of cities with the most concentrated poverty. Um, and I grew up in the area of one of the largest uh, communities of concentrated poverty in the U.S., and it's our West End in Louisville. Louisville has a definitive line. Um, of separation and segregation that the entire city knows about, and it's Ninth Street, and it's literally known as the Ninth Street Divide. And when you cross Ninth Street, it is blacker and it is poorer than just about every other neighborhood within the city. One of the zip codes within across the Ninth Street Divide, 40203, historically is one of the poorest zip codes in the nation. And so that's just to give you a bit of a framework of where I grew up at. And so when you talk about not just segregation, but concentrated poverty. There are a lot of ills that come as a result of that. You're talking about, of course, drugs, talking about crime and violence and all those things. What our city has done a poor job at is we have we have labeled the byproduct, the effects of concentrated poverty, as though it is an issue of race and class, as opposed to an issue of a lack of resources. And what not just in the U.S., but of any nation in the world, when you have that many poor people in such a large community, you have everything that happens within that community happening. And so we've done the research. Wherever you have that many people who are poor, who don't have resources, whose communities have been stripped of every possibility of hope, all the signs are the same. The byproduct is the same. There's crime, there's violence, there's drugs. People trying to do their best to heal or to medicate themselves past the pain, the hopelessness and despair that comes and results oftentimes in crime and violence, people trying to find whether a tribe or affiliation to hold on to, which results in gangs and the things of the nature. But it happens all over the world. And so I grew up in that, in a place that was heavily flooded with drugs, violence, and things of that nature. And yeah, and a city that has done its best to try to turn a blind eye and a deaf ear to the realities that historically what has come of that neighborhood was actually something that was created. So it is the neighborhood, although now predominantly black, is was actually historically white. And with the expansion of the University of Louisville here and its campus around the same time as white flight happened at that time, many African Americans were then relocated to this neighborhood. And of course, as a result, as they moved in, many of the whites moved out, and the neighborhood transformed over time, which means that jobs and resources and a number of things were also taken from that neighborhood as they relocated. So that's kind of where I grew up, how I grew up in the space in this city. So I I recognize that within that it has because it's so prevalent. Like you'd almost have to be completely ignorant not to see what's taking place. Growing up, I lamented and I despised what I saw in my neighborhood. And because, of course, due to busing, I was bused in middle school and high school to one of the most affluent communities in the city. And for the life of me, again, being young and just not understanding things, I couldn't understand what we did to deserve to have to live like that, that separated us from the way that those who lived in the more affluent communities, what did they do? Why were they better than us that
Mm.
they were able to live this way? And so my childhood, just in those thoughts, it's kind of what, you know, the beginnings of my story kind of shaped how I look at things. So,
Mm. Yeah. If I could ask a follow up question,
mhm,
and thank you for sharing all that. Um, you kind of spoke to some of the emotional experience of those, living in poverty or just, yeah, who were not members of the more affluent communities, the despair, the hopelessness, and kind of what
mhm,
behavior that might lead to. I'm curious, and you've shared, kind of where you were, how you felt, and how you saw the world. What did you observe from others in the community? And that's obviously a bit of it's kind of difficult because you're speculating, or maybe but what is there kind of this feeling of like, well, this is just the way it is, like, it's just kind of the status quo of Louisville, and there's really nothing we can do about it, or generally, I don't know if
mhm.
anything comes to mind with that.
No, no, absolutely. That would be, for the most part accurate. That would be the feeling of many people. But then also, when it comes to people, and this isn't just even necessarily a race thing. There are many African Americans, people of color, who live outside. Well, we currently live outside of the Ninth Street Divide ourselves, but people today from the African American community who won't cross Ninth Street themselves because of the division socioeconomically. And so many people believe that, yeah, either that's the way that it is, or that those people there, they created that. Um, that they don't want anything better for themselves. that, when it comes to what we know to be symptomatic of the conditions, they believe to be the reason why the conditions exist within themselves. And so they are ignorant to how the hopelessness and despair, how it then leads to drugs, to crime, and things of that nature. But in their minds, they say, "No, man. If you want better, then you shouldn't do drugs. There shouldn't be crime." And so that's when you get outside of that community, there are many people who look at the symptoms and say it's the source of the problem. And that's been much of what I think, a lot of what, myself, what we've tried to do as a church throughout the years, and even myself and my wife, kind of some of our personal mission is to educate, especially some of you would think more informed friends and neighbors. That when you have conversations across the coffee table or around the dinner table, you hear these comments and these phrases, and you recognize how flawed the thinking of people, how either they are listening to political pundits or allowing the media to shape their ideas about what's happening on the ground level in our communities. And so we began trying to work to educate people about what's really taking place. So one of the things that we've done, um, and we haven't figured out how to start it up, but restart it. But for about a year, we held these events that we called table talks, and recognizing that oftentimes one of the best places we see this in scripture and in our own relationships that you get to know someone is by sitting around the table and having a deep in conversation with them. So we facilitated that. This a restaurant that's kind of has a missional purpose, which is across Ninth Street, one of our historic neighborhoods, and we invited. It started with some of the religious leaders who were from the suburban parts of our neighborhoods. I'm sorry, my MacBook is about to lose its battery, so I'll plug it in. And so we invited many pastors and religious leaders, denominational leaders from it's the separation in Louisville is three ways. It's east, south, west. West is considered black and poor. East is considered white and affluent. South is considered basically working class. And so which is a whole nother thing right there, to think that a city can be defined that easily, right? But we'd invite a lot of those from the east to come down and sit at the tables with those from the west, and we gave some historical lessons about things, both based rooted in scripture, but also we brought some scholars who educated everybody on what's going on. One of them was we had a conversation about mass incarceration. I have a friend, Dominique Gilliard, who wrote a book on mass incarceration. So we invited Dominique down, and he did a beautiful presentation, and which goes back to the roots of mass incarceration, all the way back to slavery, Jim Crow, and many of the lynchings that took place. And our hope was that we knew that there were some stories that people were telling themselves about um, whatever the issue is, mass incarceration, violence. My wife is she's a consultant, and she does a number of things, and so she did for corporate world. She has a session on hidden bias. And so she did an entire workshop on hidden bias and was helping to show people that they have biases, even us as Christians who think that we do not. We were forced to sit around the table and discover that we looked at people differently based upon either the color of their skin, or where they lived at. And so the hope was that we could, like Saul, help the scales to fall off people's eyes. Because what we want to do is get beyond the labels to see people in their full humanity. And so this is the idea of the beloved community, right? that it is not about whatever labels that we ascribe to people. It is not that they are black, they're white, red, or brown. It is not that they are poor or homeless. It is not that they are straight or gay. None of those labels are important, nor should they be prevalent. What's most important is that people were created in the image of God. And we've got to get to the point where that's how we start looking at people, even within their religious affiliation. Those of us who call ourselves followers of Christ must learn to love people regardless of what God they bow down to. We were called to love. And so we were trying to challenge the church through some healthy conversations and dialogue to move beyond what oftentimes the stench of white supremacy and patriarchy has placed upon the faith that we love so dearly.
That is so powerful. I thank you so much for sharing all of that. And it's just, yeah, what you just shared is so, it's really like hitting me in a deep place. And yeah, you have such great insight on beloved community, of course. And um, I think it's interesting because what you're talking about with this sort of racial and socioeconomic segregation in Louisville is something that exists in cities across the US. Like
Yeah.
it's prevalent. I mean, even here in BC, it's like it's split up into wards and it's like, oh,
Mhm.
don't go to that ward, that's the bad ward and
Yeah.
things like that. So thank you so much for, yeah, enlightening us about that and the importance of that history.
I love the idea of gathering around a table and having conversations, but and maybe listening more listening first, and kind of yeah, seeking understanding and education on a particular topic. I just think there's such value in sitting across from someone who comes from a different perspective, and yeah, all taking in the same information and then kind of unpacking it together.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just love that.
And I love what you're saying too about the focus on humanity as opposed to these different labels or identifiers, because at the end of the day, like we all are created in the image of God, and like you said, we're called to love.
Mhm.
It's so powerful. And
Mhm.
going back to this idea that Louisville was a locus, among others, of the long-awaited racial reckoning in that began to occur in the wake of the pandemic, with the murder of George Floyd and countless others, and the rise of BLM activism in spring 2020, and with Breonna Taylor's murder being in Louisville. Could you speak to what you observed happening in your community and in the country at that time?
Yeah. So Louisville, because of the nature of the Breonna Taylor case, what happened here was really a microcosm of what we saw nationally. And I think what's happening locally is also it's still the same. That there were some things that we all saw and witnessed that for the first time it was impossible to deny the realities of it. And so it kind of reminds me, going back to the book Parting the Waters, one of the things that it talks about is um, one of the reasons why Dr. King wanted to go to Birmingham was because he knew that the media was going to be there. And he knew Bull Connor was going to violently oppose their efforts in Birmingham. And so he went there intentionally knowing that there was going to be violence, but he needed the nation to see that what they had been talking about, what they had been sharing from stages and pulpits all over the world was absolutely true. And the world would not know it until the world saw it. So when we watched George Floyd's murder, there's no denial there. And now we can say, hey, let me tell you that, my first interaction with the cop, um, was 10 years old going into a Burger King. And this towering figure, probably 6'5", 6'6", walks out with his partner into three 10 and 11-year-old little boys who were just going in to get some fries or something. He introduces himself by saying, "Do you know who I am?" And we're like, "No, sir. Who are you?" And his response was, "They call me Big Gun." Now, that was not an introduction, that was a threat. I didn't understand
Mhm.
it as a 10-year-old, but I knew what he was letting me know is that I'm not someone to be trifled with. That when we go home and we tell my older cousin, "Hey, man, this cop we met, and he said his name was Big Gun. He said ask about him." And my cousin says, "If you ever see him anywhere else, you go the other way." We tell those stories,
Mhm.
and historically, people are like, you're exaggerating." But then when you see a cop unmoved and unbothered by a man crying for his dear life and for his mother, we're like, yeah, the stories that we've been saying all these years are absolutely true.
Mm.
And so, of course, here then, we hear the stories of what happened with Breonna Taylor. We're grieving it, and the people are responding. But the same thing that we see within the world, or the nation, was still true here. People were concerned about structures rather than lives. This is the outrage. Oh, buildings, glass. That's like, no, those things, they have insurance, and the glass guy was there the very next day replacing glass. We're concerned about structures and buildings and the appearance of perfection, of exceptionalism, rather than really doing something to deal with the systemic issues that we are facing within this nation. And so here and nationally, I think that, to my earlier point, the scales fell off our eyes for a minute, but I think we willfully put them back on because we just want things to go back to whatever normal looks like, whatever normal is, and that we hope, that we are past it. We saw it, and we can get past it, and I think that, well, my answer, two answers. I think that. Um, we see the realities of that and what we're seeing politically right now, as voting rights are being stripped, as you know people's rights, women's rights are all being stripped, just in real time. I think all of this, you would think that we'd head in the opposite direction based upon what we experienced in 2020, and it seems like we're going the wrong way. However, I'm not discouraged, and I think that that's the final say so. I think what we're experiencing right now is the immediate response, but I don't think it's the ultimate um, response. I think that we've
Mm.
yet to see the results of what happened in 2020 as a result of George Floyd, as a result of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and many of those things, the convictions and all those things. That's not the result of what we're going to see nationally. I think that as time goes on, that what our nation and our world will look like as a result remains to be seen. I think it's still too early to determine what's going to come
Mm.
from, because on the flip side of it, we're always faced with what's happening in the nation, and the George Floyd Police Act not passing, voting rights being attacked, women's rights being attacked. We see those things, the false narrative of CRT, critical race theory being attacked throughout the state legislatures, throughout the nation, and we see all those things, and we think, okay, this is all that's happening, when really what's happening is in the grassroots level, that there are people who are working hand to hand within the communities, who are strengthening residents, people, individuals within the community, that we will see the results of today. Maybe not till 10, 15, 20 years from now, but we will eventually see the fruit of it to come pretty soon. It's my belief that too often, and so um, I was once participating heavily with. One of the things that Dr. King or his primary focus when he passed was the Poor People's Campaign. It's had a resurgence here the last few years with Reverend goodness, Liz Theo Harris, and my goodness, I can't think of his name right now. It'll come to me again, just like William Barber, with Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris. And so they're leading it nationally right now. And I was heavily involved in it in its early stages. And I drew back because when I was trying to recruit people throughout the state of Kentucky to be a part of this, the issues, when people hear them, they're massive, right? Like when we're talking about what needs to happen in our nation and in our, it's everything seems so huge that the average person is like, well, what can I do? What power do I have? And so, in researching and studying and just looking more at the civil rights era, we see those larger than life figures, Dr. King, and we see many of those figures throughout the nation. And like, God, these people were mountainous, great figures, right? Diane Nash and all of them wonderful people. However, the work didn't get done because of them. It was the everyday average citizen who decided to, not for what they wanted to see happen in the US, but better yet, what they want to see in their block, what they wanted to see in their neighborhood, what they wanted to see in their own city. And because of the little brush fires that they sparked in their communities, it became an uncontrollable, immovable fire that lit and changed the entire nation. So I began to think, like, if I'm going to spend my time, what I would rather do, rather than working on a national level, not that I'm necessarily a national leader at all, but what I would rather do is I would rather do my part and help as best with this big elephant. I'd rather just help scoop out little pieces, and let's figure out how to take it a bite at a time. And so that's what I've devoted my time to the last few years, just piece by piece and little sections, so that everybody can see their value and their purpose in helping this thing to take shape. And so if you can't see yourself, maybe traveling to DC or someplace else, maybe you can't even afford it. Well, what you can do is you can afford, if you don't have a vehicle, you can afford $1 to ride downtown. And or you can carpool with somebody to the state capitol. Like, there's something that you can do in your neighborhood, something you can do within your family and around tables. And so I figure my role at this point, both as a pastor and as a community leader, is to help people see the value that they can contribute to their own specific neighborhood.
That's awesome. And I think it's such a beautiful point about like working towards the beloved community within the context that you're in, because we
Mhm.
can't necessarily tackle everything that's like hindering the beloved community, especially within like systemic issues or structural issues, that there are people addressing those. And that's really important and we should support that. But how can we even like be working alongside those efforts at the grassroots level or at the interpersonal level? So that's really beautiful. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. So Martin, who's your friend, he shared with us about the church merger that you helped facilitate.
Yeah.
We would love to hear more about that. What inspired that intentional decision to kind of fuse those two faith communities, and what, I imagine that process wasn't straightforward or easy by any means, but perhaps it was. Like, what did you learn in the process of that? What was that like? Yeah, what inspired it?
Got you. So, I planted a church in 2010, and it was a predominantly African American church. And around, was it 2013, we relocated to another neighborhood. We found ourselves doing more work around this particular community, which kind of like central to where many of our members lived. Like most cities, most churches were, Louisville's a very transient community. by nature, but it's really indicative of our entire country at this point. But our members were all kind of centered around this one neighborhood. So we identified it and we moved there. Well, I had a friend who had planted a church. They launched exactly 6 months after we had, and it was a predominantly white church. And so, we talked. We were good friends. Like, hey, we're coming down, and want to let you know, but also, man, let's figure out some ways that we can partner in ministry together. We're stronger together. And so he actually tossed the idea of the merger then. But he ended up leaving like 3 months later. Like he took a job somewhere else and left. And the other gentleman who took over, I didn't know as well, but we began to be good friends. And so we just began hanging out. Proposed to him the same thing that I did the previous pastor. Let's get out here. Combine resources, man. And there's no point if I'm going to have if I'm going to have an Easter egg hunt on this day, you're going to have one 2 days later. It's just nonsense. Let's pull our resources and let's just have a big Easter egg hunt. Let's just do that. And so we actually began to do that. We coordinated our outreach calendars, and many of them we did as a collective, as a unit. And so the initial idea actually came from the members. They're like, listen, man, if we're going to keep doing this, what does it look like if we're just come together and be a church together? And so we didn't move on it initially, but the more that we began talking and getting to know each other, we just felt like that's the way that God was leading. And so, so we started serious conversations in 2014 about, okay, like, what does this look like? And so we began unpacking a lot of information and reading. Now, at this time, it wasn't as tense, but we're still, right on Mike Brown. And there have been some others, Trayvon Martin. And so it was very tense already. 2015, and we had Philando Castile. We had a number of things that happened, and we noticed just the tension, the racial tension that was taking place all around us. And so our conversation was, okay, if we're going to do this, then we got to recognize that we cannot bring both, this predominantly black church, predominantly white church together and not have racial righteousness and reconciliation a major part of the work. And so we started, doing everything we could, reading, connecting, having conversations, which then began to us bringing our leaders together to have some serious conversations around race, and then also starting to bring the members together to have conversations around race. So what we wanted to do is educate everybody on not only what we were going to do as a church merger, but also this is going to be a new focus for us as a church. And so really what we say is that we didn't merge, because we knew that this was going to be so significant and so different from what each congregation initially started out as. We wanted to give people permission to bow out if they didn't feel called to it. And so we literally had a Sunday where we funeralized both churches. We had we invited people, we helped to launch them, and we had two services back to back, for each of the churches. And we said, hey, listen, we understand what we're asking you to do is challenging. And church is one of those places that you choose, not necessarily that you're forced, or you're forced to go to work and all these other places. We don't want this to be something that burdens you. So if you don't want to move forward, it's okay. You are blessed to go do something else. And so we put that out there, and then we closed the doors. Even though we could have, launched and started having services immediately, we closed the doors, and for a few months we just had internal conversations and tried to get to know each other. We did, a lot of conversations around tables, and our services essentially were workshops and talks around reconciliation, around bias, and things of that nature. Of course, rooted in scripture. And then we launched it in the last Sunday of January in 2016. with the hopes of being a reconciling community um, that would um, that would ultimately be a lighthouse, man, for our city and for people who are seeking to worship in the context in which heaven's going to eventually look like. And but we were serious about, and they still are, even though I'm no longer there, still serious around the conversation of diversity, but also on making sure that there is equity amongst genders and that it's a completely inclusive neighborhood. So man, we launched at one point in time. I think we were probably 30% LGBTQ in our congregation, and so it became a safe and a protected space. And so we made sure that that was going to be a space that they didn't have to fear. That we intentionally put women in places of authority to make sure that people could see men submit to the authority of women, and so we really worked hard. They still work hard to try to make that a focal point. What we saw, at least one of the things that I believe that it did help with is, of course, 7 8 months later, we had this historic election, right? And for lack of a better word, historic, and the grief that it caused that permeated throughout the community. We became a place, man, where people could come for healing,
Mm.
and people could have good conversations that they could hear from either their African American brothers and sisters or white brothers and sisters, the pain of the moment, and it yeah, it's still probably one of the most significant times of my life. Just the conversations, having people. Martin was significant and essential in that. Some of the conversations that he and I had in that period, I'll always cherish. And some other people whom, for many of us were really grieving because 2016 really exposed something. It became a place of healing for many people. So, yeah. So the church is still going. The church is called One Church. It's a beautiful expression of God's kingdom, and yeah, man, and they're still doing really great work in our city.
Wow.
Wow.
Mhm.
Sounds like such a beautiful example of the beloved community being lived
Absolutely.
out.
Mhm.
In real time. I have a quick follow-up question to that and to something that you said earlier. So our audience is many are Christian, but not everyone certainly. But hopefully this is relevant for all. But I'm thinking about what you've said about the beloved community in connection to the church and going back to the early church and how this is, kind of in our DNA. And
Yeah.
then you mentioned in the process of combining faith communities that you gave the option to some who wanted to bow out to go elsewhere, and that was fine, and you blessed them. I guess, yeah, I'm wondering about those maybe particularly within the church who this concept of beloved community, it doesn't hit, it doesn't resonate, it doesn't
Mhm.
yeah, it's just like, yeah, um I don't know, how do you pastor those individuals or groups, and because obviously you can't bully someone into
Yeah.
joining in on the beloved community vision, so I guess, yeah, what comes to mind there?
Yeah. So, we when we gave people the option, blessed them to leave. Some left immediately, and then some stayed. A lot stayed. We launched our first service, open service. I mean, it was probably, for a church plant, this is significant. About 260 people in our first service, and so and there was a lot of great energy. What I know is that sometimes people, we can be in love with the idea of a thing. It's kind of like marriage. Some people love the wedding, but they don't like the work of marriage.
Mm.
And so what we saw was people loved the idea of it, but the work of the beloved community was fearful because it requires you, similar to marriage, it requires you to give a lot of yourself. And you must submit a lot of your preferences in order to meet the needs of the community. That's what we see in the book of Acts and Acts 2, right? We see them submitting a lot of what they have. They brought their resources, they brought their time, those things, and they submitted it for the sake of the community, not for themselves. And so we started out with about 260, at least for about the first month or the first couple of months. That's kind of where we dwell, somewhere around that area. And by October of that year, we were about at 40.
Mm.
So we grew that thing down. I mean, it was exceptional growth, man. I'm telling you, it was beautiful. And but as depressing as it was, what we saw was really, kind of what you're speaking to, is that once people really saw what this was requiring, what this was asking, is like, oh, wait a minute, I didn't sign up for this.
Yeah.
Like, I thought we were going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya and everything was going to be okay. But it exposed a lot, in people, not only, some of their own biases and prejudices, but also, the consumerism that many of us have adopted as Western Christians. That I show up and I show up, man. Listen, I kind of need 60, 75 minutes of something, and then I need to be let go home. And we're saying like, hey, we're not. That's not what we're doing here. Like, what we're trying to figure out is how to intentionally and create something that would be a haven for all people, and many people just didn't want to surrender to that, and so we had to have essentially a weeding out so that the people who were supposed to be there would come. So yeah, we grew it down, but it grew back up. It grew back up. Just to let you know. Yeah,
That's good.
yeah,
I love what you're saying about laying down your preferences, because I think, and understanding that sort of sacrificial love
yeah.
that was, modeled for us by Jesus. So how can we like adopt that ourselves and live that out in the context of beloved community?
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah. It's not easy. I
No, not
appreciate
at
you saying
all.
that. Like, it's
Not
not
at
easy.
all.
It
Not
takes
at
hard
all.
work.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, it took a toll on us emotion. I didn't know. I'm pretty even kilter. Like, I never, I don't really have highs and lows. I'm pretty much this guy 24/7. I didn't know that I stressed until then. And I
Mm.
saw my body viscerally responded to the I saw it. I broke out in hives and had sleepless nights. Like, it took a toll on me in ways that I didn't even know I was possible for me. I thought I could handle all things. And that was one of the times I was like, okay, I'm not as strong as I think I am. Like, yeah.
Mm. So I guess in light of that, what did you come to sort of like depend on? Did you find a way to sort of, or how did you manage that stress, and what helped you through that?
Um, yeah. So again, not to sound hyper spiritual, but prayer, learning to slow down, um, learning to truly lean on processing my emotions. I'll plug another book that really helped me in that season, Scazzero's Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And taking some time, man, and going into the daily office and really allowing God to speak to the depths of my soul, which I'd recognized I never had. I was good at doing the work of looking and performing as a Christian. I was terrible at being and living as a Christian, and so that kind of helped me there, just to grow up a little bit more emotionally and spiritually.
So I guess just to close out, and then of course anything you want to add is more than welcome. But how do you see how do you see yourself? How do you see yourself within your community moving forward towards this vision of beloved community? And in addition to that, how you've kind of already spoken to, what changes you're seeing, how the needle's already being moved. But I guess how would you encourage um, us, but our listeners, us representing the listeners, to join you in this work, to join in the vision of beloved community, if especially if it feels a bit daunting or you don't know where to start?
Gotcha. Yeah, so for me, here's the irony of the conversation. And when Martin reached out to me, um, I took over this church, and this is my childhood church where I grew up, so it's very dear to me,
Mm,
and it had declined significantly over the years, and so I took over um, a little over a year, so the first Sunday of January 2021. So right in the middle of the pandemic, I take over as lead pastor there to help revitalize and help to bring a little bit life back to the church, to that congregation. Um, right in the middle of everything that we're experiencing. So there's still very much a lot going on in the city as a result of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, of course, here locally. And when I showed up there, of course, before that, I was there for some months before taking over. And these conversations were so prevalent in everything. In my mind, then I was thinking, man, what the community needs right now is the beloved community. And
mm,
I was holding on to it. And so I revisited, I reread some stuff and started taking notes. And so our theme moving forward is we are New Horizon Baptist Church, a beloved community.
mm.
We had just settled in on that before I spoke to Martin, and I'm like, okay, God, you want to talk about
Oh, wow.
an affirming call? Like, I really
Uh,
believe that we are headed in the right direction just because of this conversation moving forward. And so I feel like my role, both there as pastor and even in serving for a small nonprofit, we are 9 people. We're really a small nonprofit. My role there is to help to do my part to make that come into fruition. And so my wife and I, we're talking now about what does it look like to begin to both train and develop. My wife, that's what she does. She trains and develops leaders, train and develop our leaders to be those who are ambassadors of the beloved community, not just within the local church, but wherever they find themselves Monday through Saturday. And so we have a bunch of trainings and conversations moving forward to help with that. And so I look at myself more as like a coach more than a pastor,
mm,
and I want to empower players for the kingdom to go and do their part, to play their role wherever God has planted them, so they can blossom well. And so, to answer that question, where do I see myself? That's what I see myself doing: empowering people and plugging in and helping to do my part, so that they can see this as a possibility. Now, the way that I know how to do that, I mentioned earlier, it's in that old adage. How do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time. I have the ability and the gift to help people to see things and to break it down into smaller parts so that it's not as threatening, so that fear or anxiety doesn't get the best of us. Because when we see things, oftentimes it's too massive, it paralyzes us. And so the average person needs to know that I can make a difference. Well, how can you make a difference? You don't have to worry about whatever massive deals that the average person can't do. You let that to somebody else. What you can do is you can have healthy conversations at work. You can inform your family members. You can redirect. Your crazy uncle when he says, irresponsible things across the dinner table. You can, there's a number of things that you can do when we understand what we're working towards. You can help people to look beyond whatever myths or stereotypes that we see with the thousands of homeless individuals, persons that we see at the ends of expressway exits all around the country. There's more to them than whatever story of addiction and irresponsibility that we tell ourselves because we don't want to reach in our little change bank and give them 50 cents or just a little bit of change. Like, there's something more there that we need to be able to see the value in humanity. And so
Yeah.
my role, what I see right now, is helping people to see how they can make a difference where they are. And we do that within my job. Is we are often brought to the table to engage the community, and the reason why is that we engage with people that most people will overlook. So the
Mm.
neighbors that people think won't help are often the ones that we partner with the most to do some of the greatest things that happen within neighborhoods throughout the city. So,
That's amazing. Wow. I'm just in awe of like everything that you've shared today and the stories that you've shared and learning about how you're working towards the beloved community there in Louisville, and just pray that that will reverberate throughout the country and the state and other communities as well. And you give us such an amazing example to follow. So thank you for
thank
that.
you guys for having me and allowing me to share.
Wow, that was such an amazing conversation. And I'm so grateful to have had that opportunity to talk with Jamel and learn from his example of fostering the beloved community where he's located there in Louisville.
Yeah,
Amazing.
100%. I feel like he is, we had the privilege of hearing from Reverend Adam Russell Taylor, who gave us, some ideas and theories. And then talking to Jamel Armstrong, it was like we were seeing them lived out, and kind of like what beloved community might look like in practice. And so I thought one thing that keeps coming to mind as I reflect back on the episode is, well, so many things, but when he was talking about the table talks that he's been facilitating along others in his community, where essentially people gather around a table, diverse backgrounds, and talk about various issues, incarceration, things that might be divisive, and then they bring in a speaker, somebody who might educate and provide some context for that issue, and then they discuss, kind of like rooted in this idea that that's where connection happens, is around the table. I've been thinking about that, and also something that he got into at the end of the episode. Like, what do you think it requires for someone to want to be part of that? Like, for someone to pursue, especially maybe if you're not touched by the issue personally, like what does it require for someone to want to sign up for something like that, to go to a place where like it's going to be uncomfortable,
Right.
and you might be humbled a bit? Like, what? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I wonder that too, because I think obviously not everybody is going to want to, like we learned from Jamel, is not everyone's going to want to partake in that journey or put themselves in that uncomfortable position. And so I do think it, but I think like it has to start somewhere, right? Like with someone. So whoever is interested, like start there and then kind of go outward from that, I think. I mean, I don't know because I've never had to do something like what he's done, but yeah, I think that's such a good question to consider. Like, as we engage in peacemaking, not everyone's going to want to participate in that, and like, there's not really much you can do except extend the invitation. But the people who do want to be there, like, focus on those relationships and building the community out from there. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I definitely agree. I think that it is evident that like reconciliation, peace building, peacemaking requires work. And, I think there has to be a willingness to work if you're going to find yourself in a space of reconciliation, whether that be attending a table talk or being part of like a church merger, which Jamel led. Like I remember when he was talking about how um, when people realize, and this isn't to like shame or call out anyone, but when people realize that it wasn't going to be just, holding hands and singing Kumbaya with the church merger, and it was actually going to be kind of difficult and uncomfortable. Like some are like, well,
Mhm.
this isn't what I signed up for. And so I think, I think it definitely requires a willingness to work, which isn't necessarily
Yeah.
appealing, especially if you don't have to, if you're not like being faced with a conflict,
Mhm.
you're like choosing to kind of enter and learn and then
Mhm.
respond. It's like, yeah, who would sign up for that? you know?
That's so true. Um, that's so true. But I think it's like within the context of like Christianity or the church, like for those who are seeking to follow Jesus, I think that really speaks to, okay, like what Jamel was talking about. Are you willing to lay down your preferences? Are you willing
Mhm.
to pick up and carry your cross, as it were? Like, are you willing to live out that sacrificial love that Jesus modeled for us and showed us and continues to show us,
Right.
um, give to us? Like, are you willing to like follow him into that
Mhm.
place? And I think that's a really important thing to bring up. Like what you're saying, it's like, I think for those who maybe carry the power or privilege within a particular conflict or division, don't really feel the effects of that conflict or division in the same way.
Yeah.
Um, like you're saying, like, well, this doesn't really affect me that much. Like, I can still sort of just keep living my life and doing my thing because I
Right.
don't feel the effects tangibly.
Right.
But I do wonder if, like, for those of us who do carry that sort of power or privilege within a certain situation, like,
Yeah.
if there's a greater like impetus for us to be willing to lay down our preferences in
Hmm.
order to like follow Jesus into that space of reconciliation.
Right.
That's just something, yeah, that I've been reflecting on.
No, I think you're spot on with it being authentic to who we are and who we say we want to be like, I mean, that is central to who Jesus is. And I mean, definitely agree with you. I think about Philippians 2, when Paul writes like that Jesus, I'm gonna like not quote it correctly, but basically Jesus, who was equal to God, made himself nothing, and like taking on,
Right.
um,
Yes.
becoming obedient and like, I just think that is the picture of what we're trying to do and who we're trying to be, and like laying down our power and like, or wielding it to like lift up those who are powerless in certain conflicts. And I mean,
Hmm.
when Jamel had brought up that experience, I think he was in childhood of the cop, essentially threatening him.
Hmm.
And he was like, we can only ignore stories like that for so long until it's like in our face.
Hmm.
Um, And
Right.
then, with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and just the events of 2020, obviously our country kind of faced this like racial reckoning moment, and then it could no longer be ignored. And so, I don't know, I guess I'm just connecting that to the idea of like it is, we have to, if we're on the side of power in a conflict or in a particular issue, like it takes us laying that down in order to hear those stories. And it shouldn't take like these crazy events that get attention, you know, for us to then start, spotlighting, or I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I love what you were saying earlier about like choosing to step into that place, which I think like if we're following Jesus, like it's almost like how could we not do that, you know? And
Right.
then but it does take humility and it does take a certain sacrificial love to do that, but I think that's like what we're called to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so and I think it's, you know, like everything that Jamel shared about his experiences growing up in America and like you know, when we ask the question of like what is more valuable to God, like is it people, is it human life
Right.
that bears the image of God, or is it like, you know, these like he was talking about like property versus like the value of human life and things like that. And I think we have to ask the question of ourselves, like, who does God value? Like, who is important to God? And it's everyone, you know? And so how do we live that out?
Yeah, that is a really, really good point. I think like, I love that perspective of what does God value in this particular context. I think we can feel a certain tie or feel like we owe loyalty to an idea, or thinking about Louisville specifically, and but not even, I mean, here as well, the stories that we tell about the poor and those who are unhoused, you know, which he also brought up of like, well, you know, they got themselves there. Like we can be so loyal to those ideas, I feel like more than we are to God and to like what our faith says about the situation, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
That's a
for
great
sure.
point.
And I feel like it just asking those questions I think really helps because it's easy to get caught up in what's happening around us and like the ideas people are sharing and like groups of people that we identify with. But like when we can pause and say, okay, what does God care about in this situation?
Right.
Like, yeah, who does he value and what's his perspective or his heart that we know of towards towards this group of people or towards like this conflict or whatever may be going on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like it was just such a great encouragement and reminder and like kick for me to recall, or just to acknowledge the fact that like, you know, the church should be the primary place where we see beloved community lived out. And so, I mean, yeah, that's just something to reflect on and then hopefully follow and practice of like, how do we do that? But just, man, so many things from this episode.
So good. I know. Oh, so amazing. And maybe we can go visit him someday in his church. That would be awesome.
That would be so cool. Yeah.
So grateful for him. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts. And for more info about Peace Catalyst and to help support our peacebuilding work, please visit our website at peacecatalyst.org.
Thanks, everyone.